All right, hey YouTube, how you doing? It's Max. In this video, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess some abstract concepts, the meaning of life. So this video, I have a little script here, and it is something that might be hard to follow. So there might be some gaps in my own logic in this, but it's just the thought of the day, so I figured why not? We're almost at 100 videos, so let's just get with it. So in the introduction of this, I wanted to talk a bit about, I guess, what is the meaning of life? And this is kind of just one of those questions that I feel like we're just naturally fascinated by. So, like, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What's our purpose? Those kinds of questions. And these are questions that I feel like we try to simplify a lot of the time, which is probably this is what I'm going to do in this video. But I guess they're complex questions, so I'm going to try to also explain the complexity of trying to tackle this kind of question, and then provide my own sorry, short and sweet kind of answer to it. And I guess just some examples. While I was writing the script, I was like, what's some examples of us preferring short and sweet over long and complex? So when I was doing this, I was thinking, like when you're reading a text or an email, you kind of like short, sweet responses a lot of the time instead of long, convoluted ones, long, wordy things when you're reading a book or something as well. Also, thinking about how, in stories in general, we tend to sort of define characters as good or evil, just to really simplify it. And, some people, enjoy a story with a lot of complexity and nuance. But I would say that if you get too technical with the nuance, it starts to become this sort of, I guess, in the general sense of, and this might just be my opinion, but the general vibe is that that's kind of like an elitist take, an elitist stance, whereas like the pop music version of like characters, I feel like it's just this is good guy versus bad guy, like Marvel movies or Star Wars or Harry Potter. There's a good guy and a bad guy. There might be a little bit of nuance, but generally we like to categorize characters as good or evil. And then, kind of also we do this thing where we like to stereotype people, just as like a species as a whole. So over time, we've kind of stereotyped, people by their skin color or their ethnicity. And even in like high school, we have the standard nerd or jock or punk kind of titles for people. So I guess this is mostly just to highlight that we as a species prefer simplicity as opposed to complexity. And I think that we as humans overall are trying to find these patterns through this simplicity. So I kind of just wanted to preface this with that. um, and again, I think it's kind of bold of me to try to create a video of the meaning of life. So I also just want to provide a disclaimer that these are just kind of like thoughts and opinions, on how I see the world, rather than something that you should take super seriously. Another thing I kind of want to talk about before talking about my answer to the meaning of life, even though it's in the title, is this distinction between objectivity and subjectivity. And I think that like most people, know what the difference is between objectivity and subjectivity, but I think it needs to be kind of highlighted. And this is where it might get a little bit kind of complicated. But I think that, when you are trying to address the question of what is the meaning of life, a lot of times people are looking for this objective answer that applies to everybody. And I think a big kind of, you know, a big, what's a culprit of this, maybe is the right terminology, is religion. And some people are religious, and this wasn't really prefaced as being a religious related video, but this is just, if that's something that bothers you, this might not be for you. But um essentially, I think that religion tries to tell people what the meaning of life is. And they provide an answer that everyone just needs to do this one thing, and if they do this one thing, there will be this reward. And that's how I think they kind of objectify this question. And if you don't do this one thing, then there's this punishment you receive. So it's really kind of trying to create this black and white scenario out of the complexity of reality. And I think that this, as I was kind of saying, this idea of making something more black and white helps us make sense of something that's a bit complex. Because we understand this general idea of cause and effect, and we also, I think, in general, us as people like rules and expectations to be laid out. That's why we have societies with laws, and that's how we function. Going, it kind of relates back to the whole like choice and consequence video I kind of made, where we have this choice to follow this one religious edict, I guess, and if we don't, then there's a consequence. If we do, there's also a consequence. And I don't believe that our existence is really that simple at the end of the day. I also don't believe that you can objectify a concept like this as with subjective. I think that this is overall a subjective thing. We're using subjective parameters to really define something that shouldn't be defined as objective, if that makes sense. um, so like when I think about objectivity, what is objective? I think of it as a binomial. And I think this is like ones and zeros or true and false statements. It's not like um I guess I'll explain it, but basically objectivity is true or false statements. Either something is or isn't. And I think an example of this might be like, it is true that I am living right now. It's either I'm living or I'm not living. And that's an objective fact that I am currently living right now. Because if I wasn't living, I would be dead. And that's just kind of a one or the other objective. In that we're trying to, I guess, by using religion, we're trying to objectify something that is not that simple. It's not like what is the meaning of life isn't um, it just doesn't compute as having an objective answer, if that makes sense. And so when you try to use this binomial logic to the meaning of life, as I was saying, it's just not um, overall, the meaning of life isn't asking a true or false question. It's there's a spectrum of answers you could give it. And I guess, like, so to be a little bit more specific, we'll use like Christianity. So you could say that the meaning of life is that if you follow Jesus to get to heaven, that is the objective answer. And my argument here is that that's not an objective answer ultimately. And I would say this is kind of a weird comparison, but it's similar to saying that the Beatles are the best band that's ever existed. And to prove that the Beatles are the best band that's ever existed, you can come up with kind of a collection of premises to prove this statement as true, but you're sort of defining these variables in a way that follow a subjective train of thought rather than a binomial train of thought, if that makes sense. So I think that this is, you know, in order to declare that Jesus is the key to heaven as an objective truth, you sort of already have to believe a variety of things. You have to believe that heaven exists. You have to believe that Jesus was the Son of God and did everything that he did. You also have to believe that all of the Bible's teachings are objective and divinely inspired. And so by using this one thing that's subjective to prove this other thing that's subjective, it sort of becomes this circular argument. And it's the same thing with the Beatles in a way, where if you declare that the Beatles are the best band as this objective truth, you also need to declare that selling albums is the best criteria in which to measure an artist's talent for this. And at the end of the day, selling albums could be ruled as an objective quantitative detail. But when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture here, um, you know, over the time, if you go back to Beethoven and Mozart, they weren't really selling albums. So is that a fair comparison? Uh, equating the Beatles selling albums as the defining factor to Beethoven and Mozart and all of them. Also, you're talking about like Ed Sheeran in the modern era, and we don't really buy albums anymore. It's more about like listening on Spotify. And so, The Shape of You has over 3 billion streams on Spotify alone, not counting any other, YouTube or um, Apple Music, all those other things. So really the parameters, the variables that we're playing with here when determining what the best band ever was, they vary. And so ultimately it's a subjective kind of sphere of conversation, not really an objective one, if that makes sense. Because time period can have an effect on, how we define those parameters of what makes the best band. So I don't know if my point here is being well explained, but it's meant to demonstrate that the meaning of life is just a subjective claim. And because a religion is trying to define our purpose in life, um, that is a subjective claim that is similar to trying to determine the best artist or the best song. And this is a much different argument and uh, kind of conversation to have than trying to figure out if one is simply alive or not. Because of there's just this vast spectrum of details that we're trying to determine when figuring out subjective truths. Um, and I find it better to say overall um, that like if you're trying to determine the best song ever, you should probably just go, in my opinion, my favorite song is Yellow Submarine by the Beatles, as opposed to the Beatles' Yellow Submarine is the best song of all time, or same thing with Ed Sheeran. And again, I would relate this back to my claim about subjectivity in a religion by saying that it's better to claim something like, for me, Jesus is the key to heaven and what gives meaning to my life. And that's just my opinion, as opposed to saying following Jesus is the meaning of life. It's kind of using subjective language as opposed to objective language. So yeah, I'm not really sure if any of this is making sense. I think that it does, but I'll have to watch this back and see if that's true or not. But I'm gonna move on to what I was kind of talking about with my answer to the meaning of life, which is to chase that feeling. And so this is also kind of hard to, I guess, articulate correctly, I think, because here I am kind of being oxymoronic in a way, if that's the right way to say it, of trying to come up with this ultimately subjective answer to this ultimately subjective question. And I guess my goal isn't really to be objective about it, but to be universal about it, if that makes sense. Um, so yeah, this might seem a little bit contradictory just based on how I've been presenting all of this, but I think it fits. And so my answer to what is the meaning of life is to chase that feeling. And I feel like it's also sort of this cop out answer because it's really like what I'm really saying here is to chase the feeling, uh, which brings life meaning, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's not really a profound answer, but I think it works. And at the core of this conundrum, all meaning really is whatever we define it to be. And so I guess, sorry, still kind of recovering from a little bit of a cough, but um, humans are unique creatures because we have this complex language and the ability to define words and create sentences. And I'm kind of taking a step back here, so bear with me. But the universe doesn't really, operate on using nouns or exclamations, syntax or grammar. And a chair, it's the common kind of example of your chair might be different than my chair. Your hat that you visualize is different than my hat that I visualize. Someone might think of like a baseball hat, or someone might think of a top hat. This is all just kind of language is just symbols that we use to define things. And so the word meaning, when you're trying to tackle a complex question like what is the meaning of life, the word meaning doesn't really exist in reality. It just exists in our collective imagination, in how we interpret the world, how we've defined through language what meaning is. And that's a very kind of interesting thought experiment. What is the meaning of meaning? But what I'm trying to say is that we all interpret the world differently. We use language to try to communicate to find this common ground, and it's for this reason that the meaning of life question, it's ultimately a question that can't really be answered with objective binomial answers. Yet, I would argue that chasing a feeling is an action that every single person uniquely partakes in every day. Therefore, I think it's an accurate answer to the question. So it's combining this answer that applies to everybody without it being completely objective and giving you a list of instructions. It's sort of describing the question, if that makes sense. Um, and so like with chase that feeling, the reason why it's not more specific is because I don't think that there's a single particular feeling that we're specifically chasing all the time. I don't think that there is a specific feeling that we need to be chasing. So, for example, love might be something that someone might say is the meaning of life. I don't necessarily think that applies to everyone. I don't think, well, it might. I think it's a bit too specific in trying to objectify it again, whereas that feeling is a bit more subjective and is up to interpretation. It's broad and non-specific. So if you have this goal to find love, as I was just saying, that could be what gives you meaning. But at a given moment, that might not be someone else's drive. Someone else might have a different goal to feel more intelligent or feel more talented compared to their peers. And it's not really love as the feeling that drives them. It's this superior kind of competitive nature that drives them. And this isn't chasing that feeling isn't really defining one person's feeling as better or worse than another person's feeling. It's just saying the meaning of life is what feeling is driving you to continue to find meaning in life, if that makes sense. What's giving your own life meaning? That's the meaning of life. So at the end of the day, this becomes a never-ending quest. We may find the feeling, we may find that feeling of love, but that feeling is always fleeting, and it doesn't ever last, forever. We will always kind of have these kinds of ebbs and flows of feelings, and we may see things like you can never experience like true happiness without ever feeling despair. If you ever heard something like that before, that's why it's good to have despair so that we can um, really understand what true happiness is. But I think like the answer of chase that feeling helps explains it explains this behavior. Like it's this continuous like another analogy might be we're running on a treadmill, right? And you're chasing this carrot on the stick, and that carrot in this example is that feeling. And um, eventually we'll catch that carrot, and we'll eat the carrot and we'll be satisfied. But then that carrot isn't going to last forever. So there's always this other carrot that appears, and we have a new reason to continue to chase. And if that carrot never reappears ever again, then we have this feeling that life is meaningless until we find that new carrot. So I guess there's no objective reward for catching the carrot. You could say like, you get sustenance from it, but I think that's a little bit besides the point. At the end of the day, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't really matter how many carrots we catch, except to us. Inevitably, there will be a day where the treadmill stops and we are unable to catch any more carrots. And while our time may be finished catching carrots, I don't think that there's necessarily any winning or losing unless we define there to be winning or losing. So that's another reason why I don't think this is an objective thing. It's more subjective if we define what winning and losing is, because as I was kind of talking about with language and how we define it, I don't think that there's really objective winning or losing in the universe, the grand scheme of things, because we all die at the end of the day. I think winning and losing is just this subjective thing, not objective. And the only objective featuring in this scenario kind of relates back to the whole you're either living or you are not living. And that's a binomial true or false, not really any feeling put into it whatsoever. It's just a fact. And but before we get to that stage, everything is just subjective. Depends on what we hold to be valuable, what we hold to be unvaluable. And I guess all I'm really trying to say in this is that life is just whatever you want it to be. And that just doesn't really sound like a very satisfying answer, but ultimately, I think that's just what it is. Like, meaning is inherently subjective, and therefore, we can't really define something inherently subjective as objective. However, as humans, we sort of do crave these, like an answer that's universal to this question, something that applies to everyone. And I think I just believe that to chase that feeling is the best answer to that question, in my opinion. It's both subjective and it's a universal answer that applies to everyone. And there might be a better way to say to chase that feeling as the answer, but I think that's just how I like to interpret it. And, at the end of the day, that's kind of just all this is what it's about. It's just, whatever you think life is about, that's what life is about. And you keep living until you die. And yeah, so I don't really know if any of this made sense. It wasn't really meant to be like a depressing video. It was just kind of like a thought-provoking video. It was my thought of the day, I guess. So yeah, I guess let me know what you think the meaning of life is, and have a good one later days.